Musa Alayhissalam stood against Fir'aun. Ibrahim Alayhissalam stood against Namrud. And after Isa Alayhissalam, someone else would rise against the oppression of Rome. Jerjis Alayhissalam. But this time, the story was different. Because he was killed 4 times. 4 times he tasted the pain of death, and each time he returned except for the last. And the story did not end there. On the night when a magician believed through tears, the fate of the city began to change. And behind all of this, there was an even greater mystery. Why was he sent during the period of Fatra? And why did he remain one of the most mysterious prophets in history? In this video, you will discover one of the least known, yet most shocking stories in Islamic history. You are watching Religious Story TV. To support more deep Islamic documentaries like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and support us with your comments. If you are ready, let's begin. In the years after Isa Alayhissalam, the lands of Palestine, Sham, and the nearby regions looked strong from the outside. The Roman Empire was building roads, controlling cities with huge armies, and raising stone palaces. But under that greatness, there was fear, there was silent oppression, and there was a heavy darkness crushing the hearts of people. Rome's iron fist was especially cruel about religion. The empire saw everyone who did not obey them as a threat, especially those who believed in one Allah. In Islamic sources, there are views that the cruel ruler known as King Dadyan may have been the governor of Mosul during the time of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian, who ruled between 284 and 305, carried out systematic massacres against believers during the period historians call the Great Persecution. During this time, Palestine and Syria were filled with blood. People bowed in front of statues made by their own hands. They hoped for help from stones and placed the commands of kings above the commands of Allah. Huge idols were rising in city squares. In temples decorated with gold, people were forced to make sajda. On one side, there were drunken feasts. On the other side, there were slave markets. On one side, there were rich tables full of food. On the other side, there were people dying from hunger. As the truth was forgotten, mercy was disappearing from the earth. People lived only for power. The weak were crushed, the poor were exploited, and people saw the life of this world as if it were the only reality. That is why Islamic scholars describe that era not only as a political collapse, but also as a spiritual collapse. People had started to see evil as normal. There was fear in the cities. People were hiding their faith. Many worshipped only at night. Du'as were made in whispers because a single wrong word was enough for torture. That is why, while speaking about Ashab al-Ukhdud, the Qur'an says, "They took revenge on the believers only because they believed in Allah, Al-Aziz, Al-Hamid," Surah Al-Buruj 8. And no matter how much the darkness grows, Allah always brings out a light from somewhere. Musa Alayhissalam stood against Fir'aun. Ibrahim Alayhissalam stood against Namrud. And under the shadow of Rome, a silent and unknown man was being prepared. In the town of Remle in Palestine, there was a merchant unnoticed among the crowds, but the iman inside his heart would one day shake an entire kingdom with fear. And the name of that man was Jerjis Alayhissalam. In the markets of Mosul, golden statues of Apollo were being sold. On the roads of Syria, Roman legions were patrolling. In Palestine, smoke rising from temples covered the sky, and in the middle of this darkness, he would stand alone against the entire system. There are some people who live among crowds, yet nobody truly knows who they are. They are quiet, they live far from showing off, but the value they carry in the sight of Allah can sometimes be greater than an entire army. Jerjis Alayhissalam was one of those people. According to narrations, he was a righteous servant who followed the path of the believers remaining after Isa Alayhissalam and secretly lived the true religion. Some Islamic sources describe him as a Nabi, while other narrations describe him as a righteous friend of Allah. But all narrations agreed on one point: he was a man who lived fearlessly for the sake of Allah. At that time, Remle was one of the busy cities connected to major trade routes. During the day, the noise of the markets filled the streets. The smell of spices spread through the stone roads. Camels carried heavy loads and merchants counted gold coins. But at night, the city showed another face. People whispered in narrow streets. House doors closed quietly. Worship was done in secret because of fear. Those who believed in one Allah could no longer live openly. Jerjis Alayhissalam grew up in this world. But what separated him from other people was not only his iman. He became very wealthy through trade. He traveled from city to city, buying and selling goods. But at the end of every year, when he calculated his earnings, the first thing he did was not to grow his wealth. He gave it to the poor, and there was a famous saying narrated from him, a very deep saying: "I work for the poor and needy. I work so they may live in comfort." Think about it. In an age where people crushed one another for wealth, one man was giving away what he earned with his own hands. Because in his eyes, wealth was not a goal. It was only a trust from Allah. That is why in the cities where he traded, he did not only buy and sell goods, he also told people about the true religion. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said in a hadith, "The best of people are those who benefit others." The life of Jerjis Alayhissalam was like a living example of these words. And during those days, news coming from the east began to reach Remle. A cruel king named Dadyan had built a golden idol in Mosul and was forcing people to make sajda in front of it. Those who refused to worship it were being thrown into fire. When this news reached the city, many people chose silence because of fear. But Jerjis Alayhissalam did not stay silent, because for some people, speaking the truth is like breathing. And on that day, the silent merchant of Remle decided to begin one of the darkest journeys in history. At the head of the city of Mosul was a cruel ruler named Dadyan, influenced by the dark, idol-worshipping system of the Roman Empire. But what truly made him terrifying was not his power. It was how well he knew how to use people's fear. In the center of Mosul, he had built a giant idol. It was made entirely of gold. When sunlight touched its shining surface, it blinded the eyes. Its name was Apollo. The king did not present it as an ordinary statue. No, he turned that idol into a symbol of authority. And he told the people, "Make sajda and survive, or resist and die." And the people were afraid, because huge fires burned in the middle of the square, towers of wood, the roaring sound rising from the burning coals, black smoke climbing into the sky, and trembling people standing before those flames. According to narrations, those who refused to make sajda to the idol were thrown into the fire in front of everyone. Some bowed down while crying, some fainted from fear, and some resisted until the very last moment and walked into the flames. And during those very days, a caravan entered through the gates of the city, a simple group of merchants coming from dusty roads. Nobody knew they were people who would change the course of history. Inside that caravan was Jerjis Alayhissalam. As the camels moved slowly after the long journey, a strange tension could be felt in the air of Mosul. People spoke in fear. Soldiers walked through the streets. Smoke rose from the squares. And then, Jerjis Alayhissalam saw the scene. The scream of a mother, people being dragged in front of the fire, crowds forced to kneel before the golden idol, According to the sources, this scene deeply shook his heart, because he was not only a merchant, he was a believer, and true believers cannot remain silent in the face of oppression for long. That night, he spoke with the believers beside him. The city was silent. From far away, only the crackling of the fires could be heard. The sky was covered with red smoke. And Jerjis Alayhissalam had already made his decision. He would go to the palace and warn the king to stop his dhulm. This was not an ordinary decision, because at that moment he was practically signing his own death sentence. But even so, he did not fear. And the first thing he did was remarkable. He gave away his goods, his gifts, his wealth, to the poor and to the believers. It was as if he was cutting his final connection to the world, because there was no turning back anymore. When morning came, Mosul was crowded once again. The square was full. The golden idol still rose above the people like fear itself. Dadyan sat upon his throne. The fires were burning. And at that very moment, a man began walking through the crowd. He was not afraid. He did not step back. His steps were calm. His eyes were determined. While soldiers looked at him in shock, he walked directly toward the palace. Because sometimes the thing that changes the course of history is not the arrival of an army, but one person deciding not to be afraid. And now, for the first time, the cruel king of Mosul and a servant of Allah would stand face to face. Palaces look powerful to people. Marble columns, golden thrones, hundreds of soldiers, and a ruler before whom everyone bows down. But sometimes a single sentence reveals the fear hidden inside those massive palaces. That day, the palace of Mosul was living through one of its usual days. Torches burned along both sides of the great hall. Trembling shadows moved across the dark red stone walls. The armor of soldiers reflected the firelight, and the golden idol of Apollo rose deep inside the hall. Dadyan sat upon his throne. There was arrogance on his face, because until that moment, nobody had dared to stand against him. People bowed before him. They lowered their eyes to the ground out of fear. And then the palace doors opened. A man wearing simple clothes entered the hall. He carried neither wealth nor greatness upon him. But without realizing it, everyone in the hall began looking at him. Because some people walk silently. Yet they change the atmosphere wherever they enter, and that was how Jerjis Alayhissalam walked. According to the narrations, Dadyan was at that very moment raging against those who refused to worship Apollo. And without hesitation, Jerjis Alayhissalam began to speak. "O king, why are you angry at the servants of Allah? You too are only a servant of Allah." The entire hall suddenly fell silent. Nobody even breathed, because these words had been spoken directly to the face of a ruler and in front of thousands of people. But Jerjis Alayhissalam did not stop. He pointed toward the idol. "That thing you force people to make sajda to can neither hear nor see. It can neither benefit nor harm. Allah is the one who created both you and me. So why do you force servants to bow before other servants?" Dadyan's face began to change. First came shock, then came anger, because all his life people had trembled before him, but the man standing in front of him was not afraid. And the greatest fear of tyrants is people who do not fear them. Dadyan stood up. The silence inside the palace became heavy and frozen. Punishing this open challenge alone was not enough. First, he wanted to humiliate him in front of everyone and satisfy his enormous pride through argument. With a mocking smile on his lips, he asked, "If the one you call your Lord is truly powerful, then why did he leave you poor like this? Look at me, look at my palace, look at my people. My God gave me power. Through him, people became rich." Many people inside the hall liked these words, because the power of this world always looks undefeatable from a distance. But there was not the smallest trace of fear in the eyes of Jerjis Alayhissalam. In a calm voice, he answered, "Allah gives to whom he wills in this world. and he gives to whom he wills in the Akhirah. But when he gives eternally. Your kingdom is temporary. Today you are here, tomorrow you are beneath the earth." Those words were like an invisible arrow piercing Dadyan's heart. Because tyrants hate death, and they hate those who remind them of it. Dadyan shouted, "Who are you?" And with the same calm tone that never changed, Jerjis Alayhissalam replied, "I am a weak servant of Allah. I came to call you to Allah." He did not threaten, he did not shout, and he did not fear, because sometimes truth shows its strongest form while speaking calmly. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said in a hadith, "The greatest jihad is speaking the truth before a tyrant ruler." And that day, inside the palace, that was exactly what was happening. One man, standing alone, was becoming the fear of an empire. And Dadyan was beginning to understand one thing. This man could never be silenced unless he was killed. In anger, he raised his hand, he turned toward the soldiers, and he gave the command that echoed through the palace, "Bind him." And now, one of the darkest tortures in history was about to begin. The atmosphere inside the palace had become heavy. As the flames of the torches trembled across the stone walls, soldiers surrounded Jerjis Alayhissalam. The crowd moved aside. Some avoided looking because of fear. Others held their breath while watching him. Because everyone knew one thing, something terrible was about to happen. Dadyan rose from his throne. His face was tight with anger. And for the final time he asked, "Will you make sajda now?" Jerjis Alayhissalam answered without hesitation. His voice was calm yet sharp. "Sajda belongs only to Allah." And with those words, every trace of mercy disappeared from the palace. The king raised his hand, and the soldiers tied him to a great wooden pole in the square. The wind was blowing hard. Dark grey clouds began covering the sky. The people of Mosul gathered in the square with fear. Some covered the eyes of their children. Some cried silently, but nobody dared to speak because fear had fallen over the city. Then the soldiers brought iron combs. According to the narrations, these combs were used to tear apart his body. The iron shined beneath the torchlight. And then the first strike came. As the iron comb ripped across his blessed body, a deep murmur rose from the crowd. Blood spread across the stone ground, but there was something strange. Jerjis Alayhissalam was not screaming. He was not groaning. There was no fear on his face. It was as if he was looking somewhere beyond the pain itself. Some soldiers began turning their eyes away, because no normal person could endure such suffering like this. But the torture did not stop. Again and again. According to the narrations, pieces of flesh were tearing away from his body little by little. But Dadyan was still not satisfied, because he did not only want to cause pain, he wanted to break his iman. He gave another command to his soldiers. Vinegar was brought, salt was brought, and they poured them onto the torn wounds. Fearful cries rose from the crowd. Some people turned their heads away, others could no longer bear to look. But Jerjis Alayhissalam was still the same. His lips were moving. Some narrations say that he continued making dhikr of Allah during those moments, because the body may suffer, but iman lives somewhere deeper. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said in a hadith, "The people tested most severely are the prophets." And that day in the square of Mosul, people were witnessing a living example of those words. But Dadyan still did not stop. This time, a massive piece of iron was brought. It was placed into the fire. Slowly, the metal began turning red. First, dark red, then nearly white. The roaring sound of the flames filled the square. The soldiers lifted the burning iron with metal tongs, and Dadyan shouted, "Now let us see if your Lord will save you." They pressed the burning iron against the head of Jerjis Alayhissalam, and then, in a single moment, everything became silent. The body of Jerjis Alayhissalam remained motionless. His head fell forward. The soldiers stepped back. Dadyan took a deep breath. At last, he thought he had silenced him. But at that very moment, the sky began to darken. The wind grew violent. The atmosphere above the square changed. And for the first time, the people began to feel what real fear truly looked like, because this story was not going to end here. At that moment, there was an unseen mercy in the middle of the square. According to the narrations, an angel said to Jerjis Alayhissalam, "O Jerjis, be patient, this tyrant will kill you 4 times, and by the permission of Allah, I will return you back 3 times. On the 4th, you will reach the rank of Shahada." These words were glad tidings in the middle of death itself, because sometimes Allah reveals His greatest secrets in the darkest moments. And then, the silence in the square broke. First, there was a slight movement. One of the soldiers stepped back in fear, because the body tied to the pole had moved. Then, slowly, Jerjis Alayhissalam lifted his head. Screams rose from the crowd. Some people ran backward, some collapsed to the ground from fear. The faces of the soldiers had turned pale white, because the man they had killed with their own eyes was moving again. His torn body was slowly returning to its former state. According to the narrations, Allah brought him back to life. Then Jerjis Alayhissalam straightened himself while still tied to the pole. The ropes loosened. He slowly stepped down onto the ground. He brushed the dust from his clothes. It was as if he had not faced death only moments earlier. But this was not the thing that frightened people the most. What truly shook them was the peace on his face. Because a person without fear is something tyrants can never understand. Dadyan took a step backward. For the first time, there was real fear in his eyes, because this was no longer about rebellion. This was about a man whom even death could not silence. With slow steps, Jerjis Alayhissalam began walking toward the palace once again. The crowd moved aside. Nobody dared to touch him. The hands of the soldiers were trembling. And in the middle of that great silence, Jerjis Alayhissalam said the very same words again, "O Dadyan, believe in Allah." At that moment, fear changed sides in Mosul, because now it was not only the people who were afraid, the king himself had also begun to fear. While describing Fir'aun against Musa alayhissalam, it is said, they rejected it out of dhulm and arrogance, even though their hearts were convinced. What Dadyan was experiencing was exactly this. His heart could feel the truth, but his arrogance prevented him from bowing down, and arrogance sometimes leads a person not only to denial, but to destruction. Yet Dadyan still would not surrender, because some tyrants do not soften when they see the truth. They become even more savage. And now another death was being prepared, this time not fire, but a boiling cauldron awaited. When Dadyan saw that Jerjis Alayhissalam had returned to life, he prepared an even more terrible plan to silence the fear growing inside him. That night, the fires of Mosul never went out. In the great square behind the palace, soldiers worked restlessly. A massive cauldron was being built, made from thick iron, larger than a man. Hundreds of pieces of wood were piled beneath it. The flames lit up the night. A deep red glow struck the stone walls, and a heavy smell of burning spread across the city. People were afraid to leave their homes, but at the same time, they were curious about what was happening, because now everyone was speaking about the same thing, the man who died and returned. According to the narrations, Dadyan ordered a massive cauldron to be built and huge fires to be lit beneath it in order to finally kill Jerjis Alayhissalam. But the thing he truly wanted to destroy was not only a man. It was the hope beginning to grow inside people. Because tyrants know one thing well: once a society stops being afraid, the kingdom begins to collapse. When morning came, the square was crowded once again. Even though the soldiers tried to look strong, There was unease in their eyes, because they too had started to feel that this was no longer something normal. And then Jerjis Alayhissalam was brought forward. His hands were tied. The marks of the previous tortures were still on his body, but there was still the same peace upon his face. It was as if he was not walking toward death, but toward an invitation. Dadyan stood before his throne. His voice echoed across the square. "Now let us see whether your Lord will save you from this fire." The soldiers dragged Jerjis Alayhissalam toward the edge of the giant cauldron. Heavy steam rose from beneath the lid. The water inside was boiling violently. The iron cauldron shook with a deep roaring sound. The flames were so massive that people had to turn their faces away. And then they threw him inside. The lid was shut. Heavy iron chains were locked into place. A deep silence covered the square. Only the sound of the fire could be heard. The cracking of the wood, the roaring coming from inside the cauldron, and the fearful breathing of the people. Hours passed. Some narrations say the lid remained closed for a very long time. Dadyan waited. This time, he was certain, because nobody could survive fire. But there was one thing he did not understand. If Allah wills to protect a servant, even fire obeys his command, just like the fire of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam said in a hadith, when Allah wants good for a servant, he tests him. And sometimes that test becomes heavier than the human mind can bear. But the help of Allah also comes from within that very hardship. Finally, Dadyan raised his hand. "Open it." The soldiers slowly approached the lid in fear. The chains were removed. The heavy iron cover was lifted little by little. Everyone in the square held their breath. And then a scream of fear rose from the crowd, because Jerjis Alayhissalam was there, alive, unharmed, and calm. According to the narrations, when the lid was opened, nothing had happened to him, and the expression on his face had not changed. There was still the same determination in his eyes. It was as if he had not been standing inside a boiling cauldron, but beneath a cool shade. Some soldiers stepped backward. A spear fell from the hand of one of them onto the ground. The crowd looked at one another in fear, because now it was becoming difficult to deny. This was not normal. This did not look like the work of a magician. This was something else. Dadyan's face had turned pale white. For the first time, he truly looked helpless, because now he was no longer fighting only a man. He was standing against a power he could not understand, and the most terrifying enemy is the one a person cannot understand. Then Jerjis Alayhissalam stepped out of the cauldron. He walked slowly forward. The crowd moved aside. Then, looking directly into the eyes of the king, he spoke the same words once again. "Did I not tell you that my Lord has power over all things?" At that moment, for the first time, sparks of Iman began to appear in the hearts of many people in Mosul. But for Dadyan, this was not the beginning of surrender. It was the beginning of even greater madness, because killing him was no longer enough. He needed to completely separate him from the people, and for that reason, the prison gates were opened. Because Mosul was beginning to change, the whispers were growing. In the markets, people secretly spoke about the same thing. What if he truly is sent by Allah? For tyrants, there is nothing more dangerous than this, when people stop fearing and start thinking. That is why this time Dadyan chose a different path. Instead of killing him, he wanted to break him. According to the narrations, Jerjis Alayhissalam was thrown into prison. But the king was still not satisfied. So that he could not speak to people or call anyone to the true religion, his hands and feet were nailed down, and heavy stones were placed upon him. That night, the gates of the ancient underground dungeons beneath Mosul were opened. Soldiers walked through narrow corridors carrying torches. The sound of dripping water echoed through the halls. Rusty chains dragged across the ground, and finally they reached the deepest cell. It was a place where sunlight never entered. The stone walls were covered with moss. The air felt heavy. It was as if every breath pulled darkness into the chest. They leaned Jerjis Alayhissalam against the wall. Then they brought large nails, thick, rusty, heavy iron nails. One of the soldiers hesitated for a moment, because there was no hatred on the face of the man before him. There was no fear either, only peace. But they feared Dadyan's command. They raised the nails, and they nailed his blessed hands to the wall. The sound of iron striking stone echoed through the dungeon, then his feet, then the chains. And after that, a massive marble stone was pressed onto his chest. The purpose was clear, so he could not speak, so he could not stand, so he could not reach anyone. Dadyan no longer wanted people even to see his face, because sometimes even the silence of a person speaks the truth. The doors closed, the footsteps of the soldiers faded away, and the dungeon became completely silent. Now there was one man alone in the darkness, but in reality he was not alone. When Prophet Muhammad ﷺ saw the companions being tortured in Makkah, he said, "Be patient, Allah will certainly make a way out." When morning came, Dadyan was restless inside his palace. He had not slept the entire night, because once certain fears enter the heart, they never leave. And now his fear was Jerjis Alayhissalam. At that very moment, the palace doors opened. Soldiers rushed inside in panic. Their faces were pale with fear. Because the man who was supposed to be inside the dungeon had disappeared once again. And at the same time, a shadow appeared at the great palace gate. Jerjis Alayhissalam was slowly walking inside once more. The marks of the chains were still upon him, but the peace on his face only made the fear inside Dadyan grow even stronger. And in that moment, the king realized something. Killing this man would not be easy, because the thing standing before him was not only a man, it was surrender to Allah. It was Iman, and it was a miracle. But Dadyan still would not give up. Now he was preparing an even more terrible death. Trees were being cut down, and lions were being left hungry. When a tyrant cannot defeat the truth, he tries to mock it. If he cannot mock it, he tries to deny it. And if he cannot deny it, he tries to silence it with torture and death. But this time, something different was happening. The people of Mosul were witnessing everything with their own eyes, and they were beginning to ask, what if Allah is truly protecting him? That single question was enough to shake the throne of a king. That night, Dadyan could not sleep inside his palace. He walked through the corridors in anger, shouting at everyone around him. But what he truly felt was not anger, it was fear, because he was seriously beginning to lose control. Then one of his advisors quietly approached him and said, "This man must be a great magician. If he came with magic, then only a greater magician can stop him." This idea felt like hope to Dadyan's desperate mind. He immediately gave the order. The most famous magician of Mosul and the nearby cities was summoned to the palace. According to the narrations, this man was known as someone so powerful that even other magicians feared him. Near midnight, the great palace doors opened. An old man entered inside. He wore long, dark robes. Talismans hung around his neck, and he carried small leather pouches in his hands. His face was harsh. His eyes were full of pride, because until that day there had been nothing he could not solve. Dadyan called him before the throne. Then, clenching his teeth, he said, "Stop this man." The magician stared at Jerjis Alayhissalam for a long time. Then, in a calm voice, he said, "Leave him to me." The square was prepared once again. The people of Mosul gathered again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Alongside fear, there was great curiosity, because everyone felt that something was about to happen. The magician placed small bowls onto the ground. He poured strange mixtures into them. He recited unknown words. His lips moved with whispers nobody could understand. Then he filled one bowl with water. He stared into it for a long time, and according to the narrations, he placed all the magic he knew upon that water. The crowd became completely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Finally, the magician handed the bowl to Jerjis Alayhissalam. There was a dark hope on Dadyan's face. This time he was certain, because he believed he could defeat anything that deceived people. But there was something he did not understand. Truth does not fight magic. It destroys it. Jerjis Alayhissalam took the bowl into his hands. Not even for a moment did he hesitate. There was no fear, no doubt. He gently raised his head and said only these words, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Then he drank the water. Everyone in the square held their breath. Dadyan watched him without blinking. The magician was completely confident, because there was no person who could survive that mixture. Seconds passed, then minutes, but nothing happened. Jerjis Alayhissalam remained standing, calm, peaceful, and firm. Fearful murmurs rose from the crowd. Some people stepped backward, some began to cry, because people were no longer able to deny what they were seeing. But the greatest shock appeared on the face of the magician himself. His hands had started trembling, his eyes widened, because more than anyone else, he knew what was magic. And this was not magic. According to the narrations, the magician finally said, "This can only be from Allah." Then, before everyone inside the palace of Dadyan, he fearlessly declared, "I have believed." The square froze. It was as if time itself had stopped. Dadyan's face turned pale like stone. Because sometimes the belief of one person is a heavier blow than 1,000 soldiers, especially when that person is the one you trusted the most. Remember, Fir'aun had also brought magicians against Musa alayhi in the same way. But when the magicians saw the miracles of Musa alayhi, they understood that it was not magic, and all of them believed at once, even under the threats of Fir'aun. This moment is mentioned in Surah Taha, verse 70, and just like Fir'aun, Dadyan rose in fury. "You too have been deceived," he shouted. But the magician was no longer afraid, because once a person sees the truth, he can never return to his old life again. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "The truth is clear and falsehood is clear." And that day, in the square of Mosul, truth and falsehood became completely separated from one another. And now Dadyan was not only afraid, he was losing his mind, because now the matter was no longer only about Jerjis Alayhissalam. The truth had entered even into the palace itself, and very soon the king would give a new command that would turn all his fear into blood. In the markets, in the narrow streets, behind closed doors, people had started secretly speaking about Allah, and Dadyan could feel it. For tyrants, the silent change of the people is even more frightening than open rebellion. For the first time, he felt his throne beginning to shake. But the thing that would truly destroy him had not happened yet. Because now, the truth was about to enter the palace itself. And during those very days, something unexpected happened inside the palace. According to the narrations, even Dadyan's own wife, Queen Alexandra, joined those who believed in Jerjis Alayhissalam. And this was the blow Dadyan could not endure. That night, silence filled the women's chambers of the palace. The torches burned slowly. The wind moved the long curtains. The queen was alone, but her mind was in complete turmoil, because she too had seen it. The man who came out of the boiling cauldron. The man the lions could not touch. The man who made poison powerless with Bismillah. And most importantly, the man who did not fear death. Sometimes a person is not affected by a miracle alone, but by the peace inside another human being. And something like that had happened inside the queen, because everyone inside the palace was afraid. The soldiers were afraid, the advisors were afraid, even Dadyan himself was afraid. But Jerjis Alayhissalam was not afraid, and that had shaken her heart. Some narrations say that the queen secretly met with believers. She listened to the message of the oneness of Allah. She learned what Jerjis Alayhissalam was teaching, and finally, the last veil over her heart was lifted. Quietly, she believed, but secrets do not remain hidden for long inside palaces. One night, Dadyan discovered the truth. At first, he could not believe it. Then he lost his mind with rage. His screams echoed through the palace, because for tyrants the greatest betrayal is when someone close to them accepts the truth. The queen was brought before him. The entire hall was silent. Even the soldiers did not dare to raise their heads. Clenching his teeth, Dadyan asked, "You too believed in him?" In a calm voice, she answered, "I no longer seek help from stones. The only true God is Allah." Those words struck Dadyan like the final dagger in his heart, because now the matter was no longer only about the people. He was losing even his own palace. In the Qur'an, the dua of the wife of Fir'aun is mentioned. "My Lord, build for me a home with you in paradise." Even inside the palaces of tyrants, hearts can still turn toward Allah, and throughout history, it has always been this way. Now Dadyan had completely lost control, because the truth had entered through the walls. Torture had failed, death had failed, fear had failed, and now, even inside his own home, people were mentioning the name of Allah. At that moment, Dadyan made his final decision. He abandoned mercy completely. The sound of chains echoing through the cold stone corridors of the palace became the sound of Queen Alexandra's final walk. They did not take her to the magnificent palace gardens. They brought her instead to the square, where suffering was the greatest. When Alexandra knelt before the executioner, there was not the smallest trace of fear on her face. Instead, the ocean-like peace she had once seen in the eyes of Jerjis Alayhissalam had now spread across her own face. Dadyan shouted, "Give this up, return to your palace, return to your throne as queen." Alexandra smiled softly. For a tyrant, this was one of the heaviest answers possible. She raised her eyes toward the sky, and her lips quietly moved in prayer. Afterward, although terrible tortures were carried out against her, just like Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun, she never abandoned her iman, and in the end, her body surrendered to the torture. Alexandra had died, but the single sentence she left behind remained inside the palace walls forever, like a hidden dhikr echoing through time. Tyrants could burn entire cities, but no ruler would ever have the power to extinguish the fire of iman once it entered a heart. According to the narrations, after the king killed his own wife, the pain and rage of losing her drove him to order the execution of everyone who had believed. All night long, soldiers spread through the streets of Mosul. Doors were broken down, homes were raided, people were dragged into the squares. Some were old, some were young, and some were ordinary people walking toward death only because they believed in Allah. But here, the heaviest part of the story truly began, because the people being killed were the people who had believed in the call of Jerjis Alayhissalam. Some had seen him in the square, some had only heard the stories about him, but all of them had united upon the same truth. Allah is one. And sometimes it is easy to kill a person, but impossible to kill a belief. The square of Mosul filled once again, but this time there was not only one man standing there, there were hundreds of believers. Some had their hands tied, some whispered quiet du'as. Women held their children tightly, old men lifted their eyes toward the sky. But the most striking thing was the peace on their faces. Because iman sometimes gives a person calmness even in front of death itself. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "No one who enters paradise wishes to return to the world except the martyr because of the honor he sees. He wishes to return and be martyred again." And that day in Mosul, people were no longer thinking about the world. They were thinking about the Akhirah. Blood flowed through the streets of Mosul. One by one, the believers were killed. But according to the narrations, not a single one bowed before the idol. And this only drove Dadyan deeper into madness, because no matter how many people he killed, he could not feel victory. Instead, every death made him feel smaller. And Jerjis Alayhissalam watched all of this. He had endured his own pain. He had endured torture. He had endured death itself. But watching the believers become martyrs weighed heavily upon his heart. According to the narrations, he raised his hands and made dua to Allah. He lifted his eyes toward the sky. Tears filled his eyes, and he said, "My Lord, take my soul now and destroy these tyrants." That dua would change the fate of Mosul, because sometimes the dua of an oppressed person brings the end of an entire city, and the sky was preparing to answer that prayer. The gates had closed, the squares had become silent, but this was not the silence of peace. It was the silence before the end, because the dua of Jerjis Alayhissalam had risen to the heavens, and the thing tyrants fear most is the dua of the oppressed. Meanwhile, Dadyan still sat upon his throne, but he was no longer the same king. The arrogance from the first day they met was gone. Fear had replaced it, because nothing he had done had brought victory. The iron combs, the boiling cauldron, the dungeon, the lions, the magicians, the massacres, none of them had silenced Jerjis Alayhissalam, and now Dadyan had only one thing left, the final death. According to the narrations, Jerjis Alayhissalam was killed for the 4th time, and this became his final shahada. But this death was different from the others, because from the very beginning, the angel had already said, "On the 4th, you will reach the rank of shahada." And now, that time had come. When morning arrived, the square of Mosul filled once again, but this time the faces of the people looked different, because many had already accepted the truth deep inside their hearts. Nobody dared to speak loudly, but the direction of fear had changed. Before, the people feared the king. Now the king feared the punishment of Allah. Jerjis Alayhissalam was brought into the square. There was tiredness on his face, but there was also peace. Because some people fear death when it approaches, and others feel reunion drawing near, and that was exactly what could be seen in his eyes. Quiet cries rose from the crowd. The believers were seeing him for the last time. Some bit their lips in grief. Some whispered silent du'as, but there was no fear on the face of Jerjis Alayhissalam. He raised his head toward the sky, and as if he had left all his suffering behind in a single moment, he took a deep breath. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "This world is a prison for the believer and a paradise for the disbeliever." For Jerjis Alayhissalam, the prison was now ending, because his real life was only now beginning. Dadyan came before him for the final time. He tried to look angry, but his voice was trembling, and Jerjis Alayhissalam stood calmly before him. The king shouted one last time, "Who will save you now?" Jerjis Alayhissalam looked at him peacefully and replied, "My Lord is enough for me. I'm going to meet him." Those words reignited all of Dadyan's rage. He raised his hand. The executioners moved forward. The silence in the square grew heavy. The wind became stronger. The sky began to darken, and then Jerjis Alayhissalam was martyred for the 4th time. This time he did not return, because now it was no longer time to return. It was time for reunion. According to the narrations, after his shahada, the punishment of Allah descended. First, the sky began to change. Dark clouds covered Mosul. Violent winds began to blow. People ran toward their homes in fear. Soldiers tried desperately to understand what was happening. Then the fire came. Some narrations say that the disbelievers were destroyed through a great punishment. Screams filled the city. The walls of the palace shook, and the tyrannical system that had spread fear among people for years began collapsing in a single night. Because Allah sometimes gives tyrants time, but He never forgets. The Qur'an says, Allah is not unaware of what the wrongdoers do. And that was how the kingdom of Dadyan ended. The golden idols, the palaces, the soldiers, all of them disappeared. But the strange thing is this: today, nobody remembers Dadyan, but the name of Jerjis Alayhissalam has continued to be told for centuries, because oppression lives loudly, but truth remains quietly, and sometimes a person dies. But the iman he leaves behind continues living for centuries. Yet the story of Jerjis Alayhissalam did not end there, because centuries later, the Western world would come to know him by another name, as a dragon slayer. A person dies, but the story continues to live. And as time passes, stories begin to change. Truth slowly turns into legend, and sometimes even the memory of a prophet takes on a completely different identity. That is exactly what happened to Jerjis Alayhissalam. Years passed after his shahada. Empires changed, cities were destroyed, new religious stories appeared. But people never forgot the man who died and returned to life. Especially around Palestine, Sham, Mosul, and Anatolia, his story continued to be told for centuries. The person known in Islamic sources as Jerjis Alayhissalam became known in the Christian world as Saint George. In the West, they called him Saint George. In the East, they called him Jirjis. And in some regions, people even confused him with Kidda, because his story was never an ordinary story. A man who returned from death, a believer who never bowed to torture, and a warrior of truth who stood alone before a tyrant king. People cannot forget stories like this. But as time passed, the original story slowly became covered, and new legends began to appear. The most famous of them was the dragon story. In the Western world, St. George began to be described as a knight who killed a dragon, a warrior on a white horse, a spear in his hand, a giant dragon before him, and a rescued princess. Especially in Europe, this image became so widespread that eventually the English declared him one of their spiritual protectors. Even in the symbols of Tsarist Russia, images of St. George killing a dragon while riding a white horse were used. But the interesting thing was this: behind all those legends, the same essence still remained. A man was standing against evil. Only the dragon had changed, because in the real story, the dragon was not a monster. It was oppression. It was arrogant kings, it was idol worship, and it was the system that enslaved people through fear. Islamic sources preserved his story differently. Tabari, Salabi, books of Qisas al-Anbiya, and many other sources continued describing his tortures, his returns to life, and his patience. Yet even so, the name of Jerjis Alayhissalam never became as widely known as the names of other prophets, because he was not clearly mentioned in the Qur'an, and there were no detailed authentic hadiths about him. For this reason, some scholars believed he was a Nabi, while others believed he was a righteous wali. But almost all of them agreed on one point: he showed extraordinary patience in the way of Allah. And perhaps because of this, many centuries later, Bediüzzaman Said Nursi reminded people of his name once again. While speaking about the hardships faced by the students of Nur, he said, "Be patient like Jerjis Alayhissalam, whose skin and flesh were torn away." Because the story of Jerjis Alayhissalam did not belong only to the past. It continued to happen again in every age. People who spoke the truth continued to face oppression. Tyrants changed, but their methods never changed. Some people still tried to silence others through fear, Some still treated worldly power as a god, and some still paid the price for truth. Perhaps that is why the story of Jerjis Alayhissalam never completely disappeared. Because in every age, people continued seeing traces of him in their own time. Places of visitation were built in his name in Mosul. Monasteries were established in Palestine. Around Jerusalem, people mentioned his name in prayers. But among all these stories, the most remarkable thing was this. People still talked about his courage, because some people enter history not through their swords, but through their patience. And Jerjis Alayhissalam perhaps made one of the quietest yet most powerful challenges in history. He taught people not to fear death. But now, there was another side to this story. The side that looks directly at us, because Jerjis Alayhissalam was not only a man who lived in the past. His story was also saying something to the people of today. Actually, the world has not changed very much. Today there may not be kings like before, but there are still tyrant leaders. And somewhere in the world, people are still being tortured, killed, and driven from their homes while everyone watches. Even today, crowds stay silent out of fear. And even today, many people ignore the truth for the sake of comfort. That is why the story of Jerjis Alayhissalam is not only a historical story, it is a mirror. When a person looks at it, he begins asking himself, if I had lived in that time, what would I have done? Would I have bowed before the idol, or would I have stood with the truth, even if I were alone? In reality, the answer to that question is hidden in today as well. Today, do you stay silent and focus only on your own life? Or at least make dua and show which side you stand on? Beyond that, do you speak out on social media, help keep these issues visible, and try to reach more people so public awareness can grow and these dhulm can be stopped? Jerjis Alayhissalam was also alone. He had no army beside him, no supporters, no worldly power. He only had Iman. And sometimes Allah gives a person only that, so he can stand against the entire world. That is why you should never see your actions as worthless. In the early years in Makkah, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was almost completely alone. Nuh alayhi salam walked for years with only a small number of people. Ibrahim alayhi salam was thrown into the fire alone. Throughout history, truth was never decided by numbers. It was decided by the heart. And this is exactly what the story of Jerjis Alayhissalam reminds us. When a person truly relies upon Allah, fear begins to change. Because the greatest fear of people is death. But someone who no longer fears death becomes impossible to stop. Perhaps that is why Dadyan could never defeat him. He tortured his body, but he could not break his will. He killed him, but he could not silence his message. Because sometimes the truth lives longer than the life of a single person. Today people still remember Fir'aun as a tyrant, but they remember Musa alayhi salam with mercy. The palaces of Namrud disappeared, but the name of Ibrahim alayhi salam continued to live. The golden idols of Dadyan also vanished. But the story of Jerjis Alayhissalam is still being told. Because throughout history, the same truth repeats itself. Oppression is loud, but short. Truth is quiet, but lasting. One of the greatest lessons Jerjis Alayhissalam left behind is patience, because he did not only endure pain, he waited for people to believe. He saw death again and again. He was tortured, he was left alone, but he never lost hope in Allah. The Qur'an says, surely Allah is with those who are patient. Perhaps this was the true essence of his story, patience, but not passive patience, an active patience that stands firmly beside the truth. Working for the cause, teaching Iman to more people, living Iman. Even in this age, these things will show us many miracles. The greatest thing missing in us today is Iman itself. Once that Iman truly exists, even fires cannot burn, and worldly causes lose their power. The Islamic armies in the past were far smaller in number, yet they defeated every enemy before them. Now there are 2 billion Muslims, yet they are constantly defeated. And the greatest reason for this is weakness of Iman. The Muslims before us chose the Akhirah over the Dunya, but today, even though we know about the Akhirah, we choose the small pleasures that are immediate and close, because the blessings of Jannah seem distant and delayed. We push away enormous eternal rewards for temporary pleasures. This observation belongs to Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, and truly many people behave this way. But we should understand the temporary nature of dunya from the palace of Dadyan itself.